All right, I want you to picture the table at your favorite local diner. What do you see? A bottle of ketchup, probably a little sticky, a sugar dispenser, and of course, a salt and pepper shaker. They're a pair. Inseparable. Always there. Pepper is the most common, most used spice on planet Earth. We sprinkle it on our eggs. We stir it into soup. We get it in those cheap little paper packets with our takeout. It's so completely mundane that we don't even think about it. We treat it like it has no value at all. And why would we? It basically doesn't. But that right there is the paradox. Because for most of human history, that same black dust was the literal definition of wealth. It was the reason we mapped the globe. It was a currency more stable than gold, used to pay dowries, post bail, and literally ransom kings from their captors. Our desperate, centuries-long obsession with pepper is what built the world's first corporations, what launched the age of discovery, and what started a few of the bloodiest wars in history. So go find that pepper shaker in your kitchen. Give it a little shake. The story you're about to hear is about what's inside. It's a story of unimaginable fortunes, ruthless monopolies, and incredible adventure. This is the story of black pepper. Think about that salt and pepper shaker again. It's not a salt and paprika shaker or a salt and garlic powder shaker. It's always salt and pepper. But have you ever actually stopped to think about why? On a fundamental level, they have literally nothing in common. Salt, sodium chloride, is a mineral. We dig it out of the ground or we evaporate it from the sea. It comes from everywhere. Pepper, on the other hand, is the dried fruit of a flowering vine from one very specific, very tiny corner of the world. And yet, it is the undisputed king of spices. And that is not some cute made-up marketing nickname. It's a title earned by sheer, brutal dominance. Today, black pepper accounts for a staggering 20% of the entire global spice trade by value. All the cinnamon, all the cloves, all the nutmeg and saffron and chili in the world are fighting for a piece of the pie that pepper just takes a massive 1/5 slice of right off the top. Which brings us to the real question. How did that happen? How did this one specific berry from a tropical forest in southern India become the universal, inseparable partner to salt? Why this spice? Why not cumin or mustard or anything else? How did it get chosen to be on every single table, in every single kitchen, in every single diner from Boston to Bangkok? Well, the answer has nothing to do with taste, and everything to do with money, power, and a little bit of luck. All right, so to answer that question, how this one little berry got picked for global superstardom, we have to go to the place where the story begins. We have to go to Pepper's home. For that, I want you to picture the southwestern coast of India. It's a long, narrow, incredibly lush ribbon of land, squeezed between the Arabian Sea on one side and a massive, nearly impassable wall of mountains called the Western Ghats on the other. This is the Malabar coast, what we today call the state of Kerala. And for millions of years, this place was basically its own little world, isolated by geography and battered by 2 different monsoons every single year. A perfect, humid, tropical greenhouse. And it was here, in the undergrowth of these ancient rainforests, that a specific flowering vine found its one and only evolutionary cradle. It wasn't farmed, it wasn't cultivated. It just grew wild, wrapping itself around Trenta and teak trees, climbing towards the sunlight. Its scientific name is Piper nigrum. This vine produced a tiny fruit, what botanists call a drupe, which is basically just a fruit with a single seed in the middle, like a cherry or an olive. They grew in these long, dangling clusters and would, for just a few weeks a year, ripen to a brilliant red before dropping to the forest floor and being completely forgotten. And here's the thing that you absolutely have to understand, because it is the entire key to the rest of this story. This was it. This was the only place on the entire planet where this plant existed. Nowhere else. For millennia, it was just another secret of the forest. An anonymous vine living out its life cycle completely untouched. but eventually people would stumble upon it. And when they did, they would realize that this little red fruit, once dried in the sun, turned into a hard, black, pungent little rock. A rock that would quite literally change the world. So, when does that little black rock finally leave the forests of Kerala and start its journey to change the world? When do we see the very first evidence of the pepper trade? Well, if you're thinking of Roman legions or the Silk Road, you're not wrong, but you're also not right. The story starts much, much earlier, and the first clue we have doesn't come from some dusty merchant's logbook or a clay tablet. It comes from the single most famous mummy in human history. All right, the year is 1881. A team of Egyptologists in Cairo is carefully unwrapping the linen-bound remains of a pharaoh who died more than 3,000 years earlier. This is Ramses II, Ramses the Great, the most powerful and celebrated ruler of the new kingdom of Egypt. And as they get to the head, they notice something strange. Lodged deep inside the pharaoh's mummified nostrils, they find them. 2 tiny, perfect, black peppercorns. Think about that for a second. In 1213 BC, at the absolute height of Egyptian power, the most revered person on earth is being prepared for his journey into the afterlife. Every single item included in this process is deliberate, sacred, and unimaginably precious. And for some reason, they chose to stuff his nose with a dried berry from a vine that grew on the other side of the known world. Now, this is actually quite important because it tells us 2 things. First, it tells us that even 3,000 years ago, pepper wasn't just a seasoning. It was an object of incredible value, an exotic, almost magical substance worthy of a god-king's eternal voyage. You don't use something common for that. You use something worth more than gold. And second, and this is the part that is just completely mind-blowing, it proves that a sophisticated trade network existed between India and Egypt a full 1,000 years before we thought it did. For those 2 little peppercorns to get there, someone had to harvest them on the Malabar coast, carry them to a port, sail them across the Arabian Sea, up the Red Sea, overland through the desert to the Nile, and finally into the hands of the royal embalmers in the capital. This wasn't some fluke. It wasn't a one-time lucky trade. This was a pipeline, a long-established, ridiculously complex supply chain that proves pepper's story as an international object of desire didn't start with the Romans. It was already well underway. So, the pipeline was there. A thin, slow trickle of pepper had been making its way from India to the Mediterranean for 1,000 years. But if the Egyptians treated pepper like a sacred object for the afterlife, well, the Romans were about to turn it into an obsession for the living. And that obsession was made possible by one of the most important discoveries in the history of sailing. Around the 1st century AD, Roman sailors finally cracked the code of the Indian Ocean's monsoon winds. They figured out that for 6 months of the year, the wind blew reliably in one direction, and for the other 6, it blew in the opposite. This meant they no longer had to hug the coastline for thousands of miles. They could just sail straight across the open sea, from Egypt to India and back, in a fraction of the time. And that turned the slow trickle of pepper into an absolute fire hose. It was a mania. Suddenly, pepper was everywhere in Rome, not just in the emperor's palace, but in every wealthy kitchen. Roman cookbooks from the time, like the famous Apicius, have pepper in almost every single recipe. They put it on meat, on fish, on vegetables. They even put it in their desserts and wine. They couldn't get enough of the stuff. Which brings us to one of the most famous writers of the Roman era, a guy named Pliny the Elder. And Pliny just did not get it. At all. He looked at this city-wide obsession with a little black berry from a faraway land, and he just shook his head. He complains in his writing that the empire is draining its treasury, shipping 100 million sesterces worth of silver and gold to the east every single year. And for what? He's completely baffled. He writes that pepper has, and I'm quoting him directly, neither sweetness nor appearance to recommend it. He's basically saying, this stuff isn't sweet, it isn't pretty, So what the hell is wrong with all of you? It's the cry of a man watching his country spend an insane amount of money on a condiment he thinks is completely pointless. But of course, Pliny was missing the point. The Romans didn't love pepper just for its taste. They loved it because it was expensive. Having a bowl of it on your dinner table, casually sprinkling it onto your food, was the ultimate status symbol. It wasn't just seasoning, it was a declaration. It meant you were powerful enough and rich enough to burn money on something that came from the very edge of the known world. This one spice built a colossal trading system that stretched across oceans and continents, all feeding the insatiable appetite of a single city. A system that was, for a while, the backbone of the global economy. But it was a system built entirely on the stability and the wealth of one thing, the Roman Empire. And as we all know, that wasn't going to last forever. And sure enough, that Roman stability wasn't going to last forever. In fact, it was about to come crashing down in the most spectacular way possible. A way that would cement pepper's status not just as a luxury, but as something far, far more important. All right, so let's fast forward a bit. The year is 408 AD. Things are not going well for Rome. The empire is bloated, fractured, and collapsing under its own weight. And standing at the city gates is a Visigoth king named Alaric, with a massive army behind him, ready to burn the whole thing to the ground. The once mighty capital of the world is now starving, besieged, and utterly terrified. The barbarians were at the gates, literally. So the Romans do the only thing they can. They send out a delegation to negotiate. They ask Alaric what it would take for him to spare the city. What is his price? And Alaric, who knows he has all the leverage in the world, lays out his terms. His demands are staggering. He wants 5,000 pounds of gold. He wants 30,000 pounds of silver. He wants thousands of silk tunics and animal hides. And the Roman envoys are probably just nodding along, frantically doing the math, figuring out how they could possibly scrape all this together. And then he adds one more thing to the list, 3,000 pounds of black pepper. Now, I want you to just stop and really think about that for a second. This isn't a negotiation over dinner. This is a warlord demanding the ransom for the greatest city on earth. And on his list, right alongside gold and silver, the literal building blocks of currency, is a spice, a condiment. This is the moment that pepper officially graduates. It's no longer just a status symbol sprinkled on your food to impress your dinner guests. It's a hard currency. It's a financial instrument. And why not? It's lighter than gold. It doesn't spoil. And as the Romans had just spent 3 centuries proving, absolutely everyone wanted it. For a guy like Alaric, on the move with an army, a bag of peppercorns was actually better than a pile of gold. It was a perfectly portable, universally accepted form of wealth. And what's crazy is, the Romans paid it. They stripped the gold from their statues, they melted down their silver ornaments, and they went to every warehouse and every market and collected every last peppercorn they could find to hand over to a Gothic king. This is a massive turning point. Because the city that had built the entire global pepper economy, the engine that drove that fire hose of spice across the world, was now on its knees, literally trading away its pepper just to survive. Rome was about to fall. The old trade routes were about to shatter. And with the world's biggest customer now out of the picture and the supply chain in chaos, that meant the price of pepper was about to go completely insane. The question was, who was going to be there to pick up the pieces? So, who was there to pick up the pieces? Who was going to profit from the chaos that followed the fall of Rome? Well, the simple answer is, an entirely new class of middlemen, and they were about to create one of the most profitable and most dishonest monopolies in the history of the world. With Rome gone, the world broke. The great sea lanes that had been a fire hose of spice suddenly went dry, and for most of Europe, which was sliding into what we now call the Dark Ages, pepper just vanished. It became a thing of myth and legend again, a substance so rare and so impossibly expensive that only the wealthiest kings and nobles could ever hope to see it. Which brings us to the first part of our new system, the Arab traders. With the rise of Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries, they took control of the old trade hubs in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea. They were the only ones left who still had the ships, the maps, and the connections to get all the way to India's Malabar coast. So they became the new buyers, the ones waiting on the docks in Kerala to load up on peppercorns. But they needed a customer in Europe. And that's where our second group comes in, the Republic of Venice. Tucked away in their defensible lagoon, with a massive fleet and a very pragmatic approach to business, the Venetians positioned themselves as the exclusive European gateway to the East. And here's how the racket worked. It was simple and it was brilliant. The Arab merchants would sail to India, buy the pepper cheaply at the source, and bring it to ports like Alexandria or Constantinople. There, they'd sell it to the Venetians for a huge profit. Then, the Venetians would load it onto their own galleys, sail it back to Italy, and sell it to the rest of Europe for an absolutely insane astronomical price. And here's the most important part of the whole scheme. Both sides had a vested interest in keeping the source of pepper a complete mystery. The Arabs didn't want the Venetians trying to sail to India themselves, and the Venetians sure as hell didn't want their customers in France or England to know they were just buying the stuff from a port a few weeks away. So, they created a commercial iron curtain and spread fantastic lies about pepper's origins. They told stories about it growing in fields guarded by fiery dragons that had to be driven away. They claimed that the groves were infested with poisonous snakes that had to be smoked out by burning the entire forest, which is what turned the peppercorns black. It was all a lie. They weren't fighting dragons. They were haggling in an Egyptian marketplace. But the stories worked. This carefully constructed wall of myth and deception made Venice the richest and most powerful city in Europe. A handful of pepper could buy a plot of land. And for nearly 1,000 years, the rest of Europe had no choice but to pay Venice's extortionate prices. But that kind of monopoly can't last forever. Eventually, other nations get tired of being ripped off. Kings in Portugal and Spain started to wonder if there might be another way to get to India, a way that went around the Arabs, around the Venetians, and got right to the source of all that wealth. And they were willing to sail off the edge of the map to find it. All right, so we've established the system. An Arab and Venetian monopoly that made pepper insanely expensive and shrouded its origins in myth and fantasy. And that brings us to one of the most famous, most repeated stories about the Middle Ages. You've probably heard it. In fact, we all have. It's the idea that the reason medieval Europeans were so desperate for spices, and especially for pepper, was to mask the taste of rotting meat. The story goes that without refrigeration, food was constantly going bad, and people would just douse it in a ton of pepper to make it edible. It's a great story. It sounds gritty and realistic, and it seems to make sense. But it is complete, 100% absolute nonsense. It's possibly the single most stubborn myth in all of food history. Let's just use some basic logic here. As we've just discussed, pepper was astronomically expensive. For a brief period, it was literally worth more than its weight in gold. A single peppercorn could be used as currency. So I want you to ask yourself, if you owned a handful of diamonds, would you use them to decorate your garbage before you threw it out? Of course not. The idea is ridiculous. And that's exactly what this was. Anyone, and I mean anyone, who could afford a spice as precious as pepper, could very, very easily afford fresh meat. They weren't poor peasants eating scraps. They had access to live animals, to butchers, to local markets. And if they really needed to preserve meat, they used the same stuff people had been using for thousands of years: salt. Salt was cheap, and it actually worked. So what was really going on? Why were they putting so much pepper on their food? Well, the answer is the same as it was in ancient Rome. It was about showing off. You didn't use pepper to make bad food palatable. You used it to make perfectly good food obscene. It was the ultimate status symbol, a gratuitous display of wealth. Piling pepper onto your roast wasn't about hiding a bad taste. It was about showing your dinner guests that you were so fabulously rich you could afford to burn a fortune on a condiment. It was pure, glorious excess. And it was that symbol of excess, that incredible power locked inside a single dried berry, that was driving the great kingdoms of Europe to distraction. Paying Venice's prices was no longer an option. A new generation of explorers was looking at the map, wondering if there wasn't another way. A backdoor to India. It was a gamble that would change the world forever. Okay, so we've established it wasn't to cover up the taste of rotting meat. We know the real reason they were piling on the pepper was to show off. A flashy, outrageous display of wealth. But there was another reason. A reason that goes even deeper into the medieval mind, and one that, to us, sounds completely insane. It wasn't just about luxury, it was about medicine. To the medieval European, pepper wasn't just a spice, it was a prescription. And to understand why, you have to understand the single most dominant medical theory of the last 2,000 years, the theory of humours. Basically, it goes like this. The human body was believed to contain 4 essential fluids, or humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each one had a corresponding elemental quality. Blood was hot and moist, phlegm was cold and moist, yellow bile was hot and dry, and black bile was cold and dry. For 1,000 years, this wasn't superstition. This was accepted science. Your personality, your mood, your physical health, everything depended on keeping these 4 fluids in perfect balance. So, how did you keep them in balance? Well, mostly through your diet. Every single thing you could possibly eat or drink was also classified as hot, cold, wet, or dry. And the guiding principle of medieval cuisine was to eat foods that would counteract your own imbalances. If it's a cold, damp winter, you eat hot and dry foods to stay healthy. And this is where pepper becomes absolutely essential. Think about the staple diet of medieval Europe. Lots of boiled meats and fish. Lots of root vegetables like turnips and cabbage. A whole lot of bread and cheese and beer. In the language of humoral theory, this entire diet was overwhelmingly cold and damp. It was a recipe for throwing your system completely out of whack, for making you phlegmatic and unhealthy. So, you had a problem. Your entire food system was making you sick, or so you believed. And what was the solution? You needed an antidote. You needed to add something powerfully hot and dry to every single meal to restore balance. And what was the most potent, most famous, most effective hot and dry ingredient on the planet? Black pepper. Suddenly, the desperation makes even more sense, right? It wasn't just about showing your dinner guests you were rich. It was about saving yourself from the cold, damp sickness that your own food was supposedly causing. It was a pharmaceutical necessity. And when you combine that medical imperative with the insane status symbol it had become, you start to understand why the kingdoms of Spain and Portugal were getting so desperate. Paying Venice's prices wasn't just financially ruinous. In their minds, it was a threat to their very health and well-being. They weren't just looking for a backdoor to spices. They were looking for a backdoor to the world's most important pharmacy. All right, so let's just take a second to recap the situation in the middle of the 15th century, because it's a pretty incredible moment. For 1,000 years, a fragile, deeply unfair system had kept a trickle of pepper flowing into Europe, a system that made a handful of merchants in Venice and the Middle East obscenely rich, while the rest of the continent paid prices that were, frankly, insane. And why did they pay? Well, as we've seen, it wasn't just about showing off your wealth at a dinner party anymore. In their minds, it was about medicine. It was a life or death prescription needed to balance out a diet they believed was making them sick. This long, incredibly complicated supply chain was teetering under the weight of its own greed and myth-making. It was a house of cards. And in 1453, someone kicked the table over. The event that changes everything happens in what is now Istanbul. But back then, it was Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the gateway between Europe and Asia. For centuries, it had been the final Christian port of call before the trade routes plunged into the east. And for just as long, the rising power of the Ottoman Empire had been surrounding it. Then, on May 29, 1453, after a 53-day siege, the city's legendary walls were breached. A 21-year-old Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed the Conqueror, rode his horse into the city and declared it the new capital of his empire. And just like that, the door to the east was slammed shut. This is the moment the commercial Iron Curtain the Venetians and Arabs had built with myths and lies becomes a very real, very physical wall. Mehmed wasn't interested in being just another middleman. The Ottomans now controlled the entire eastern Mediterranean. They had cut the line. The pepper pipeline that had fueled Europe for centuries wasn't just expensive anymore. It was gone. Now, I want you to imagine the pure, cold panic that must have washed over the royal courts of Lisbon, Madrid, and London. It's one thing to pay an extortionate price for a product you desperately need. It's another thing entirely to be told that product no longer exists, that it's not coming, not now, not ever. The supply was zero. The old map was now useless. The old ways were over. The simmering desperation that had been bubbling for a century had just exploded. This was no longer about finding a cheaper way to get pepper. This was about finding a way, any way, to get it at all. The front door was locked and barricaded. And that meant it was finally time to go looking for a back door, even if it meant sailing off the edge of the world to find it. So with the front door to India now slammed shut and barricaded by the Ottomans, the race was on to find that back door. And the kingdom that took that challenge most seriously was Portugal. For the better part of a century, they had been inching their way down the coast of Africa, a brutal, achingly slow process of mapping a few more miles, planting a flag, and then sailing home. It was a generational project, fueled by a desperate need for gold, for slaves, and above all, for a sea route that could bypass Venice and the Ottomans entirely. Finally, in 1488, a captain named Bartolomeu Dias was blown off course by a storm and accidentally rounded the southern tip of Africa, proving it could be done. The path was open, and 10 years later, in 1498, another Portuguese captain, Vasco da Gama, would be the one to finally go the distance. With 4 ships and about 170 men, he followed the route around Africa, sailed up the eastern coast, and then caught the monsoon winds straight across the Indian Ocean. They had made it. They had found the back door. When da Gama's ships finally dropped anchor in the harbour of Calicut on the Malabar coast, the legendary home of pepper, the locals were, understandably, curious. Turbaned emissaries from the city's ruler, the Zamorin, rowed out to the strange ships and asked the foreigners what in the world they were doing there. And the answer they got was incredibly blunt, and it tells you everything you need to know about the new age that was dawning. They said they had come in search of Christians and spices. Think about that. This wasn't just a trade mission. This was a crusade with a commercial objective. They believed they would find a lost kingdom of Christians, allies in their global fight against Islam, and they would get direct access to pepper. And what's crazy is, when they were taken ashore, they mistook a Hindu temple for a Christian church and literally started praying to a statue of a goddess they thought was the Virgin Mary. But the real culture shock happened when they met the Zamorin. The Portuguese presented their gifts, some simple cloth, a few hats, wash basins. The Zamorin practically laughed in their faces. This was the richest port on the planet. The Arab merchants who dominated the city's trade gave him gold and silver and jewels. These newcomers had brought gifts you could find at a flea market. He was not impressed. And this is where the story takes its dark turn. Because the Portuguese didn't just want to trade. They wanted to take over. Da Gama demanded that the Zamorin kick out every Muslim merchant in the city and grant Portugal a total monopoly over the pepper trade. This was, to put it mildly, an insane demand. You don't just sail into the world's most important trading hub with 4 ships and tell the king to evict his best customers. The Zamorin, of course, refused. So da Gama left in a huff, but he came back a few years later, this time with a war fleet. When the Zamorin refused his demands again, da Gama didn't negotiate. He opened fire. His ship's cannons tore into the city of Calicut for 2 straight days, indiscriminately leveling buildings and killing hundreds of civilians. Then he captured a number of trading ships, cut off the hands, ears and noses of the 800 crew members, and left their mutilated bodies to float to shore. This was the new European business model. They hadn't just found a new trade route, they had introduced a new kind of terror. The age of haggling with Venetian and Arab middlemen was over. The age of the spice wars had just begun. So, that new European business model, the one based on cannons, terror, and mutilated bodies, well, it worked. It worked unbelievably well. Once the Portuguese had bullied and blasted their way into establishing a series of armed trading posts, what they called feitorias, along the Malabar coast, they had it, a direct line to the source. And that meant they could do something no European power had ever been able to do before. They could buy pepper for the same low price the Arab traders had been paying at the docks in Calicut, and then ship it themselves directly all the way back to Lisbon. There was no more trip across the desert, no more haggling in the markets of Alexandria. And most importantly, there was no more Venetian middleman. The entire system was bypassed. And the effect of this was immediate and completely catastrophic, at least if you were from Venice. Suddenly, Portuguese fleets loaded with peppercorns were rounding the Cape of Good Hope and sailing up the Atlantic, dumping their massive cargoes into the warehouses of Lisbon. And as supply skyrocketed, the price of pepper across Europe plummeted. It fell by a staggering 80%, almost overnight. The Venetian Arab monopoly, that massive, 1,000-year-old racket built on myths about dragons and secret deals in Egyptian ports, it didn't just break, it evaporated. The city-state that had become the richest in Europe by controlling the flow of a single spice was now, all of a sudden, holding a product that nobody wanted to buy at a price nobody was willing to pay. This was the rupture, and this is where the story of a simple spice becomes the story of the modern world. Because this wasn't just about Venice getting knocked off its pedestal, it was a complete reordering of the planet. For millennia, all trade, all power, all wealth had flowed through the Mediterranean. It was the center of the known universe. But with this new ocean highway to the east, the center of gravity for the entire global economy lurched violently westward. The great ports of the Mediterranean, Venice, Genoa, Alexandria, they started to become what they are today, beautiful, historic backwaters. The future now belonged to the Atlantic coast, to Lisbon, and very soon to Antwerp, Amsterdam, and London. Portugal had broken the old monopoly and, in the process, created a brand new one, 100 times more profitable and 1,000 times more brutal. They were now the undisputed kings of the spice trade. But as the Venetians could have told them, a monopoly built on violence is a fragile thing, and every other kingdom in Europe was now watching, greedily, wondering how they could get their own piece of the action. So, how do you build a monopoly that's 1,000 times more brutal than the one it replaced? Well, the Portuguese had a terrifyingly simple answer. With cannons, state-sponsored piracy, and a system of organized violence the world had never seen before. This wasn't a business. It was an empire of extortion. They called it the Estado da India, the State of India. And it was, for all intents and purposes, a military occupation of an entire ocean. Their strategy wasn't just to buy pepper cheap and sell it high. It was to ensure that no one else could trade anything at all without their permission. And here's how the racket worked. If you were a local merchant in, say, India, or East Africa, or Arabia, and you wanted to sail your ship from one port to another, something your ancestors had been doing peacefully for 1,000 years, you now had to sail to the nearest Portuguese fort and buy a license. It was a piece of paper called a cartaz. It was basically the mafia's protection racket, but on an oceanic scale. And what happened if you didn't have a cartaz? Or if you were caught carrying a cargo that the Portuguese had decided was for their ships only, like pepper? Well, The consequences were swift and brutal. Your ship would be boarded, your cargo seized, your crew executed, and your vessel burned to the waterline. This wasn't rogue piracy. This was official government policy. They didn't just target competitors on the ocean. They targeted them at the source. If a local king along the Malabar coast dared to sell his pepper harvest to an Arab or an Egyptian merchant, a Portuguese squadron would appear on the horizon. They would bombard the city, burn the warehouses, and execute the ruler. They systematically destroyed any port that refused to play by their rules, all to ensure that every single peppercorn that left India did so in the hull of a Portuguese ship at a price set by the Portuguese crown. Remember the Venetians? They built their monopoly on clever deals and fantastical stories about dragons. The Portuguese built theirs on gunpowder, terror, and a mountain of dead bodies. They had turned the vibrant, multicultural marketplace of the Indian Ocean into their own private, walled-off lake. And here's the thing, it worked. The profits that flowed back to Lisbon were beyond belief. The Portuguese had created a money-printing machine, fueled by fear, and every other ambitious kingdom in Europe was no longer just watching greedily. They were taking notes and getting ready to build their own fleets. So, while the Portuguese were building their empire of extortion and the rest of Europe was taking notes, who was it that was paying the closest attention? Who was getting ready to build the next fleet? Well, that would be a small, fiercely independent, and incredibly ambitious nation of merchants and sailors that had just spent 80 years fighting a war to win its freedom from Spain. The Dutch. By the end of the 16th century, they had the ships, they had the sailors, and they had a desperate hunger for the profits of the pepper trade. They just needed to get there. The first few private Dutch voyages to the East Indies were a mind-boggling success. One expedition, the famously named Second Voyage, came back with a 400% return on investment. 400%. And when news like that gets out, well, everybody wants a piece of the action. And that created a new problem. Suddenly, dozens of different competing Dutch companies were all racing to the East Indies, trying to outbid each other at the source. And all this internal competition was driving up the price of pepper in Asia and driving down the price back home in Amsterdam. The Dutch were basically at war with themselves. They knew they could never hope to break the Portuguese state-sponsored monopoly if they were just a chaotic swarm of greedy merchants. So, in 1602, the Dutch government came up with a solution. And it was an idea so radical, so ambitious, it would invent the modern global economy as we know it. They forced all of these competing little companies to merge into one single, massive entity. The Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie. We know it today as the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC. But this wasn't just some big company. This was something the world had never seen before. It was the planet's first ever multinational corporation. To raise the unbelievable amount of money needed to build a war fleet big enough to challenge Portugal, the VOC did something revolutionary. It sold shares to the public. For the first time in history, any citizen, a butcher, a baker, a carpenter, could walk into an office in Amsterdam and buy a piece of the company, a piece of the entire spice trade. It was a way to spread the astronomical risk of these voyages across the entire nation. And here is the absolutely crucial part. The Dutch government then gave the VOC a 21-year monopoly, not just on trade, but on everything else. The company had the power to negotiate its own treaties with foreign kings. It could mint its own coins. It could build fortresses. It could imprison and execute people. And most importantly, it had the right to wage war. This was no longer a kingdom fighting a kingdom. It was a private enterprise, accountable only to its shareholders, now armed with the full, terrifying power of a nation-state. And its first order of business was to take total, absolute control of the most valuable commodity on Earth. So the VOC now exists, a private company with the powers of a nation-state and an army funded by public shareholders. Its directive from those shareholders was simple: generate profit. And its first order of business to achieve that was even simpler: destroy the competition. That meant going straight for the Portuguese. The VOC didn't try to outtrade them or outnegotiate them. They launched a full-scale corporate war. For the next few decades, Dutch war fleets systematically hunted down Portuguese galleons and attacked their forts from the coast of Africa all the way to Macau. This wasn't a kingdom fighting a kingdom for honor or territory. This was a corporation, armed with state-of-the-art weaponry and a quarterly earnings report, systematically liquidating a competitor's assets. And they did it with a kind of brutal, calculated efficiency that was genuinely terrifying. The Portuguese had built their monopoly on shock and awe. The Dutch perfected it with accounting and logistics. But even as they were smashing the Portuguese monopoly, the managers of the VOC realized something fundamental. The old model, the one where you just show up at a port and strong-arm the locals into selling you their pepper, was inefficient. It was risky. You were still dependent on local kings, unpredictable harvests, and the constant threat of a rival showing up and offering a better price. It wasn't total control. And this is where the story shifts. This is where the VOC goes from being a trading company to something far, far more sinister. Their leaders, men like the notoriously ruthless Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, came to a terrifyingly logical conclusion. The real power, the real money, wasn't in controlling the trade, it was in controlling the production. Why just be the buyer when you could also be the landlord, the boss, and the police force all at once? So the Dutch strategy changed. They stopped just building forts on the coastlines of India. Instead, they sailed further east, to the islands of what we now call Indonesia, to Sumatra and Java. And there, they didn't just demand to trade. They started to conquer. They built a massive fortified city called Batavia, today's Jakarta, as their corporate headquarters in Asia. And from there, they systematically forced local rulers to sign exclusive contracts, or simply overthrew them and installed puppet leaders. They forced entire islands to rip up their food crops and plant nothing but pepper, all of which had to be sold to the VOC at a fixed, non-negotiable, pitifully low price. This was a new kind of empire. It wasn't colonialism for the glory of a king. It was colonialism for shareholder value. They had perfected a system of total vertical integration, controlling every single link in the supply chain, from the soil the pepper vine grew in to the shops in Amsterdam where it was sold. It was the most profitable and the most brutal business model the world had ever seen, and the VOC was just getting started. All right, so the VOC had achieved total vertical integration. It was colonialism for shareholder value, a terrifyingly efficient system of conquest and control. But even with all that power, there was one variable they couldn't completely manage: Mother Nature. A bad harvest could shrink supply. A bumper crop could create a surplus and crash the price. For a company obsessed with stability and predictable profits, this was a problem. And their solution to this problem is, frankly, diabolical genius. It shows a level of long-term planning and market manipulation that was completely unprecedented, because the VOC didn't just control the trade routes and the farms, they decided to control time itself. To understand how they did this, we need to take a quick detour into botany, because here is a fact that most people, even today, have no idea about. Black pepper, white pepper, and the lesser-known green pepper. They aren't different species. They aren't even distant cousins. They are the exact same berry, from the exact same plant, Piper nigrum, just picked at different stages of ripeness and processed in different ways. Basically, it works like this. Green pepper is the berry picked when it's still young and completely unripe. It's usually pickled in brine or freeze-dried, which is why it doesn't travel well and you rarely see it. Black pepper, the one we all know, is made from the almost ripe berry, picked just as it starts to turn from green to yellow. The berries are boiled briefly and then left to dry in the sun for days. That whole process, the sun and the heat, is what ruptures the cell walls and creates that dark, wrinkled skin. But white pepper? White pepper is something else entirely. For white pepper, you wait. You let the berries get fully, completely ripe on the vine until they turn a bright, brilliant red. Then you harvest them and soak them in slow-moving water for a week or two. This process, called retting, causes the soft outer fruit to ferment and decompose until it just sloughs right off, leaving behind only the hard inner seed. That seed is then dried. Now for you and me, that's a neat piece of culinary trivia. For the accountants and strategists at the VOC, this simple knowledge was a financial weapon. It was the key to unlocking the final level of market control. Why? Because that outer fruit layer on a black peppercorn is the part that's most susceptible to moisture and mold. It has a shelf life, but white pepper, which is just the naked seed, can last for years in a warehouse without spoiling. And the Dutch understood this. So they forced their plantations in Indonesia to produce massive quantities of both. They would sell the black pepper as normal, but the white pepper they would stockpile. Think about that. They were building a strategic pepper reserve. If there was a bad harvest one year and prices started to creep up, they could flood the market with their stored white pepper to stabilize it. Or, even more brilliantly, they could create an artificial shortage. They could hold back their own shipments of black pepper, wait for panic and prices to skyrocket, and then release their stockpiled white pepper as a premium, an even more expensive alternative. They could corner the market, crush their rivals, and manipulate global prices on a whim, all because they had turned a simple berry into a financial instrument with a predictable, long-term expiration date. It was no longer just a spice. It was an asset. And the VOC had complete control over its entire life cycle, from the blossom on the vine to the dust in a shaker a decade later. So, the VOC had it all. The ships, the soldiers, the forts, the plantations, and a strategic pepper reserve that let them manipulate the global market like it was their own personal plaything. It was the most perfect, most profitable, most ruthless monopoly ever built. And you might be sitting there wondering, where was everyone else in all this? Where were the Spanish, the French, and what about the English? Weren't they supposed to be a global naval power? Well, not yet. The truth is, for most of the early spice wars, the English were hopelessly late to the party. They were sitting on the sidelines, watching with incredible jealousy as first the Portuguese and then the Dutch got obscenely rich. And as cargo ships bursting with pepper and cloves kept sailing into Amsterdam, a group of London merchants finally decided they'd had enough. They had to get in on this. So, in 1600, a full 2 years before the mighty VOC was even formed, a group of 218 English merchants pooled their money and got a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I. They called themselves the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. We know them as the English East India Company. But this was not the world-conquering behemoth it would one day become. Not even close. Compared to the state-sponsored, publicly traded corporate war machine of the Dutch, the English company was a shoestring operation, a private club of investors making a desperate, high-stakes gamble. And on their first few voyages, when they tried to sail into the heart of the Dutch spice empire in Indonesia, they got absolutely humiliated. The VOC had more ships, more guns, and zero interest in sharing. The Dutch basically treated them like mice trying to steal crumbs from a lion's den. Pushed out, outgunned, and very nearly bankrupt, the English were forced to look for the leftovers. They couldn't get a foothold in the rich Spice Islands, so they sailed to the one place the Dutch didn't seem to care as much about. A place that was, by this point, considered a backwater for the pepper trade. They sailed to India. They had no idea at the time, but in being shoved aside by their rivals, the English East India Company had just stumbled backwards into the greatest prize in the history of global commerce. They thought they were settling for second best, but they were about to find out that the real money in India wasn't in pepper, it was in empire. So, that's the board, right? The game is basically over. The Portuguese are a ghost of their former selves. The fledgling English East India Company has been bullied out of the real money and forced to settle for the leftovers in India. And the Dutch VOC has achieved total, brutal, terrifyingly efficient world domination over the spice trade. It's hard to imagine anyone ever challenging them again. But while all of this corporate warfare was raging in the East, halfway around the world, a new country had just been born. A country with no army, no navy, no allies, and absolutely no money. A country that was, by all accounts, set up to fail. The United States of America. All right, so I want you to picture the US in the 1780s. They'd just won the Revolutionary War, which was great. The problem was, in winning their freedom from the British Empire, they had also been kicked out of its massive global trading network. As a rebellious colony, they were now barred from all British ports, which had been the entire basis of their colonial economy. They couldn't sell their tobacco, their timber, their fish. They were economically isolated and on the verge of complete collapse. So what do you do? What do you do when you're a new nation, drowning in debt, with no one willing to trade with you? You turn to piracy. Not the cannon and eye patch kind, the commercial kind. American ship captains, particularly out of ports like Salem, Massachusetts, were desperate. They needed to find a high-value product, somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't locked down by the British. And they started hearing stories, whispers from sailors about the pepper riches of Sumatra and how the VOC's iron grip wasn't quite as total as they wanted everyone to believe. The Dutch controlled the major hubs, sure, but the wild northern coast of Sumatra, it was too remote, too much of a pain for them to police effectively. And that was the opening. It was one of the riskiest, most audacious gambles in the history of trade. These American captains took their small ships and sailed for 19 months, all the way around Africa, across the vast Indian Ocean, to ports the Dutch had written off. They sailed right into the lion's den, and they started trading directly with the local Sumatran sultans, offering them gold for their pepper, completely bypassing the VOC monopoly. It was illegal, it was smuggling on a global scale, and it worked. They'd buy pepper for pennies on the dollar and bring it all the way back to Salem. From there, they re-exported it to Europe, undercutting the VOC's prices and making an absolute fortune. In a few short years, the tiny port of Salem, Massachusetts became the pepper capital of the New World. This one single illicit trade route created America's first ever millionaires and pumped life-saving cash into the back-broken economy of the new republic. It was this crazy, forgotten chapter of pirate trading that helped a broke, fledgling nation find its footing on the world stage. And it happened because a few desperate New England captains were willing to break all the rules and sail to the other side of the planet for the same little black berry that had been driving the world mad for 2,000 years. The Dutch had built a perfect system, but they were about to find out that no system is perfect forever. So this insane, globe-spanning smuggling operation was working. And it wasn't just working. It was creating wealth on a scale that the new United States had never seen before. All of that illicit pepper, bought for almost nothing from Sumatran sultans and smuggled right under the nose of the Dutch East India Company, was flowing back to one tiny, unassuming port town. Salem, Massachusetts. I want you to try and picture what this looked like. For decades, Salem had been a respectable but fairly sleepy port, trading in codfish and timber. And now, suddenly, it was the epicenter of a global trade in the world's most valuable spice. Its docks were jammed with new ships, its warehouses overflowed with black peppercorns, and the whole city was coated in a fine, pungent dust. A young man named Nathaniel Hawthorne, who grew up there, would later describe it as a place haunted by the obscene fortunes of the East. And at the center of it all was a man named Elias Haskett Darby. Darby had been a successful privateer during the war, but the pepper trade was about to make him something else entirely. He sent his ships on those 19-month voyages, armed them to the teeth to fight off pirates and competitors, and reaped rewards that were almost beyond comprehension. In 1799, one of his ships returned with a cargo of pepper that he had bought for about $18,000. He sold it for $140,000. a nearly 700% profit on a single voyage, and he was doing this over and over again. He would become, by most accounts, America's very first millionaire. And he wasn't alone. The profits from this one commodity were so enormous that by the year 1800, Salem, Massachusetts, was the richest city per capita in the entire United States. A single, dusty spice had turned a New England port town into the Beverly Hills of the early Republic. But here is the really crucial part. This money didn't just build the fancy mansions that still line the streets of Salem today, although it certainly did that. This was new money. It was venture capital before that term even existed. Men like Darby and the other Pepper Princes took their staggering profits and started investing them in something new, the American Industrial Revolution. They funded the first textile mills. They built iron foundries and factories. They financed the canals and infrastructure that would turn the young United States from an agricultural backwater into an industrial power. It's a direct line. The very first engines of American industry, the foundation of its future economic might, were literally kick-started by fortunes made smuggling a dried berry from the other side of the planet. Just another legacy of the world's 2,000-year-long obsession with pepper. But there's another stranger consequence of this whole globe-spanning smuggling operation. A story that has nothing to do with millionaires or industrial revolutions, but everything to do with the food people in Southeast Asia eat to this very day. Because the Salem ships weren't just taking pepper out of Sumatra, they were bringing something new in. And to understand that, you have to understand what these ships were actually like. They were known in the East Indies as the ghost ships. They weren't big, lumbering cargo vessels. They were small, they were fast, and they were painted black to be less visible at night. Their captains were masters of stealth, appearing suddenly in a remote Sumatran cove, making their trade in a flurry of activity, and then vanishing again before the Dutch patrols even knew they were there. Their destination was almost always the northern coast of Sumatra, in the semi-independent Sultanate of Aceh. This was a wild, mountainous region that the VOC considered too much trouble to fully control, and the local Acehnese chiefs, who hated the Dutch, were more than happy to trade their pepper harvests to these mysterious Americans in exchange for Spanish silver dollars and gold. It was a perfect, mutually beneficial act of rebellion. But these American ships had been at sea for the better part of a year. They carried provisions from their own hemisphere, and along with the usual barrels of salted meat and hardtack, they carried a New World plant. A small, dried, fiery red pod used to spice up their own bland shipboard meals. A plant completely unknown in this part of the world. The chili pepper. Now I want you to try and imagine Indonesian food. What's the one ingredient you absolutely cannot picture it without? It's chili. That bright, searing heat is the soul of the cuisine. It's the heart of sambal, the ubiquitous chili paste that sits on literally every table. And here's the crazy part. Before these American ghost ships showed up, it didn't exist there. Not at all. This was a total accident. A culinary blind date set up by smugglers. The American sailors, probably just trading what they had, introduced these chilies to the Acehnese traders. And the locals, who already loved the hot of black pepper, found this new kind of fire to be incredible. It was a different sensation, a sharper heat. And even better, the plants were ridiculously easy to grow in the tropical climate, far easier and cheaper than the finicky pepper vine. From Aceh, the chili spread like wildfire, moving through the trading networks of the archipelago faster than any ship. Within a generation, it had completely conquered the local palate, becoming a fundamental ingredient from Sumatra to the Spice Islands. All because a few secretive American smugglers, obsessed with grabbing their share of the world's most valuable spice, accidentally gave Indonesia its future favorite. So for 2,000 years, that was the game. A relentless, often brutal, fight for control. Whether it was Venetian merchants spinning lies about dragons, or the Dutch VOC launching a corporate war, or desperate American smugglers sailing ghost ships halfway around the world. The story of pepper was the story of trying to monopolize the most valuable commodity on earth. But the 19th century was about to deliver a 1-2 punch that would end the game completely. A final knockout blow from which pepper's luxury status would never recover. The first punch was colonialism. The old model of a trading company, even a monstrously powerful one like the VOC, was replaced by direct, full-blown state-run empires. The Dutch solidified their rule over Indonesia, turning it into a massive pepper factory. The British, who had stumbled into India, were now masters of the subcontinent. And pretty soon, European powers were planting pepper vines wherever they could, from Brazil to Cambodia. The goal was no longer to keep pepper rare and expensive. It was the opposite. It was to produce as much of it as physically possible, to feed the growing demands of their home markets. The mystery was gone, the scarcity was gone, and the world was suddenly, for the first time in its history, drowning in pepper. And as if that wasn't enough, here came the second punch: technology. Because right as this flood of new pepper was hitting the market, the steamship arrived. Now, this is a bigger deal than it sounds. For thousands of years, every single ship that crossed the Indian Ocean was a slave to the wind, to the monsoons, to the seasons. It was a slow, unpredictable, and dangerous voyage. But the steamship didn't care about the wind. It ran on coal. It ran on a schedule. It could take a direct route, cutting shipping times by more than half, making it faster, safer, and above all, unbelievably cheap. So now, put it all together. A massive, global oversupply of pepper combined with a revolutionary new way to ship it for a tiny fraction of the cost. The result was inevitable. The price didn't just fall, it crashed, completely and irreversibly. The 2,000-year-long age of pepper as a luxury, as a form of currency, as a ransom for kings, it was over. It had completed its journey from a treasure worth more than gold to a simple grocery item, and in doing so, it finally earned its permanent spot right next to the salt shaker. Not because it was precious, but because for the first time in history, it wasn't. And so that was it. The game was over. The great pepper monopoly, fought over for millennia, wasn't shattered by a bigger fleet or a more ruthless corporation. It was simply drowned in its own success. The very forces it had set in motion, colonialism, global trade, industrial technology, had finally made it so abundant that it was no longer worth fighting over. Its demotion from a treasure to a commodity was its final, greatest victory. It had finally achieved true, absolute global domination, not by being precious, but by becoming worthless, by becoming an afterthought. And in doing so, it finally completed its journey to that one last unconquered territory, every single kitchen table on Earth. When you step back and look at it, the journey is just completely insane. This one little berry, it was a sacred offering for a pharaoh's afterlife, a status symbol for Roman elites, and a hard currency used to ransom a city from a barbarian king. It was the foundation of a Venetian monopoly built on myths and lies, and a medical necessity in the mind of medieval Europe. The desperate search for it is what sent Vasco da Gama around Africa and funded America's first millionaires. It sparked wars, built corporations, and accidentally introduced the chili pepper to half the world, changing their cuisines forever. Almost every major hinge point in the creation of our modern, interconnected world has the faint, pungent smell of black pepper clinging to it. So go back to that pepper shaker on your kitchen counter, the one we talked about at the beginning. Pick it up. It sits next to the salt, looking like its equal, its partner. But it's not. That salt shaker represents something geologic, something that comes from everywhere and belongs to everyone. It represents the earth. But the pepper shaker, it represents a story. It represents one single, specific place, and the 2,000-year-long, often violent, and almost unbelievable journey it took to get from a vine in a forgotten forest in India all the way to you. All of human history, all the ambition, the greed, the exploration, the violence, and the adventure is packed into that dusty little shaker. It's not just a condiment, it's a monument,